Imagine a windswept cliff at the edge of the known world, where the ocean meets infinity. Here, in a remote fortress in Portugal, a group of men gathered with a radical dream to conquer the unconquerable seas. They had no GPS, no satellites, just stars, courage, and an obsession that would rewrite human history. What they discovered didn't just change maps, it changed everything. This is the untold story of the Navigators of Sagres, the men who dared to sail beyond the edge of the world. If you're ready to discover one of history's greatest adventures, hit that subscribe button and smash the like, because this journey is about to blow your mind. Let me take you back to the early 15th century. Europe is a continent struggling to emerge from the darkness of medieval times. The Black Death has decimated populations, wars have ravaged kingdoms, and the economy is desperate for new trade routes. But there's a problem, a massive, terrifying problem that stands between Europe and prosperity, the unknown ocean. At the southwestern tip of Portugal, there's a place called Sagres. It's not much to look at, honestly. A rocky promontory jutting out into the Atlantic, battered by winds so fierce they seem to come from the mouth of God himself. The ancient Romans called this place Promontorium Sacrum, the sacred promontory. They believed this was where the sun sank into the sea each night, where the world literally ended. Standing here, I can almost feel what those early Portuguese felt. The Atlantic stretches out before you, endless, dark, and absolutely terrifying. Medieval sailors whispered stories about what lay beyond the horizon, sea monsters with teeth like swords, waters that boiled and dragged ships down into hell, a place where the ocean simply dropped off the edge of the earth into an abyss of nothingness. But here's where our story really begins. Around 1416, Prince Henry of Portugal, who history would later call Henry the Navigator, looked at this desolate, wind-ravaged place and saw something nobody else could see. He saw possibility, he saw the future, and he decided to build something extraordinary right here at what everyone believed was the end of the world. The fortress that emerged at Sagres wasn't just a military installation. It was something far more revolutionary. Henry envisioned a place where the brightest minds of the age could gather, where knowledge could be assembled, where the mysteries of the sea could finally be solved. He was building the launching pad for humanity's greatest adventure, the Age of Discovery. Picture this fortress in your mind. Thick stone walls standing defiant against the Atlantic gales. Inside, a complex of buildings housing workshops, libraries, astronomical observatories, and living quarters. The sound of hammers on wood as shipwrights perfected new vessel designs. The scratch of quills on parchment as cartographers drew maps of lands nobody had ever seen. The heated debates of scholars arguing about navigation, astronomy, and the true shape of the Earth. This wasn't just a place, it was an idea made stone. It was humanity's first serious attempt to systematically conquer the unknown, to turn fear into knowledge, to transform the ocean from a barrier into a highway. The location itself was strategic genius. Sagres sits at the point where the Mediterranean world meets the Atlantic unknown. It was far enough from the political intrigues of Lisbon to allow for focused work, yet close enough to Portugal's ports to launch expeditions. The prevailing winds and currents here were perfect for teaching sailors how to handle the challenging conditions they'd face on longer voyages. But more than the physical location, what made Sagres revolutionary was its purpose. For the first time in history, someone was organizing maritime exploration not as random adventure, but as systematic science. Henry was creating what we might today call a research and development center, centuries before such concepts existed. The fortress, became a magnet for talent from across Europe and beyond. Jewish astronomers fleeing persecution brought their knowledge of celestial navigation. Muslim mathematicians shared their advanced understanding of trigonometry. Italian cartographers arrived with their map-making expertise. German instrument makers came with their precision tools, all of them drawn by Henry's vision and his gold. Standing here at Sagres, looking out at that vast Atlantic, I understand why this place became legendary. It represented something profound, the moment when humanity stopped accepting the limits of the known world and decided to push beyond them. The moment when we stopped believing the myths and started seeking the truth. This fortress at the end of the world became the beginning of a new world. And the men who gathered here, the Navigators of Sagres, would soon prove that the ocean wasn't a barrier at all. It was a bridge to everywhere. Now let me tell you about the man behind all of this, Prince Henry, the Navigator. And right off the bat, I need to clear up a major misconception. Despite his famous nickname, Henry himself never actually navigated anywhere. He never captained a ship on a voyage of discovery. In fact, after his early military adventures, he rarely even went to sea. So why do we call him the Navigator? Because Henry understood something that nobody else in his time grasped. Exploration needed organization, funding, and systematic knowledge gathering. He was the world's first project manager of discovery, the first person to treat oceanic exploration as a long-term strategic enterprise rather than random adventuring. Born in 1394, Henry was the third son of King John I of Portugal and Philippa of Lancaster. As a younger prince, he knew he'd never inherit the throne, so he needed to find his own path to glory and influence. He found it in a campaign that would define his early life, the conquest of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415. Ceuta was a wealthy Muslim trading city, and its capture was a stunning success that made young Henry a hero. But more importantly, it opened his eyes to something extraordinary. In Ceuta's markets, Henry encountered goods from deep in Africa and the Far East: gold, spices, ivory, exotic textiles. He learned about the trade routes that brought these treasures north, and he became obsessed with the question: could Portugal bypass the Muslim middlemen and access these riches directly? The traditional land routes through the Middle East were controlled by Muslim states. After the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453, these routes would become even more difficult and expensive for Christian Europeans. But what if there was another way? What if ships could sail around Africa and reach the Indies directly? What if the ocean, rather than being an impassable barrier, could become a highway to wealth? This question consumed Henry for the rest of his life. He poured his personal fortune, enormous wealth from his position as Grand Master of the Order of Christ, into his maritime enterprise. He recruited the best minds, funded expedition after expedition, and refused to give up even when progress seemed impossibly slow. Henry's genius was in understanding that exploration required three things: better ships, better navigation tools, and better knowledge. He set about systematically improving all three. At Sagres and at nearby Lagos, he established what was essentially a 15th-century think tank dedicated to solving the problem of oceanic navigation. Think about how revolutionary this was. In Henry's time, most knowledge was guarded, secret, proprietary. Shipbuilders kept their designs confidential. Navigators hoarded their discoveries. But Henry created an environment where knowledge was shared, where collaboration was encouraged, where the goal wasn't individual glory, but collective advancement. He commissioned the construction of new types of ships. He funded the development of better navigation instruments. He ordered the creation of updated maps as each expedition returned with new information. He established a routine where every captain who sailed for him had to report back in detail about winds, currents, coastlines, and discoveries. But Henry's vision went beyond just finding new trade routes. He was deeply religious, shaped by the crusading spirit of his age. He saw his maritime enterprise as a holy mission to spread Christianity, to find the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, rumored to exist somewhere in Africa or Asia, to outflank the Muslim world and strike it from the rear. This combination of religious fervor, commercial ambition, and intellectual curiosity created a powerful drive. Henry wasn't just funding random voyages hoping for luck. He was building a systematic program of discovery with clear objectives: push down the African coast, find the way around to the Indies, discover new lands and peoples, claim them for Portugal and for Christ. Year after year, decade after decade, Henry kept pushing. When captains returned saying they couldn't get past Cape Boyador on the African coast because the currents were too strong or the seas too dangerous, Henry didn't accept it. He sent them back, again and again. For years, Cape Boyador was the psychological barrier, the place where even brave men turned back because they believed they'd reached the limit of the navigable world. Then, in 1434, one of Henry's captains, Gil Innes, finally pushed past Cape Boyador. He discovered that beyond the Cape, the ocean didn't boil, monsters didn't attack, and ships didn't fall off the edge of the earth. The barrier was psychological, not physical, and once it was broken, exploration accelerated rapidly. This was Henry's real genius. He understood that conquering the unknown required not just courage, but persistence, organization, and the systematic accumulation of knowledge. Every voyage built on the lessons of previous voyages. Every captain benefited from the experiences of those who had gone before. By the time Henry died in 1460, Portuguese ships had explored more than 3,000 kilometers of the African coast. They'd discovered and colonized the Madeira Islands and the Azores. They'd established trading posts in Africa. They'd proven that systematic exploration could yield extraordinary results. Henry never lived to see his ultimate dream realized: Portuguese ships reaching India by sea. That wouldn't happen until 1498, 38 years after his death, when Vasco da Gama finally completed the journey. But everything da Gama accomplished was built on the foundation Henry had laid. Prince Henry the Navigator didn't need to captain ships himself. He did something more important. He created the system, the organization, and the knowledge base that made the age of discovery possible. He transformed exploration from random adventure into systematic science. And in doing so, he changed the world forever. Now we come to one of the most debated questions in the history of exploration. Did Henry actually establish a formal school of navigation at Sagres? Was there really an academy where scholars and sailors gathered to study the arts of seamanship and discovery? The honest answer is, we're not entirely sure, and historians have argued about this for centuries. Let me walk you through the evidence and the debate, because it tells us something important about how legends are born and how history actually works. The traditional story, the one you'll find in older history books, goes like this. Prince Henry established a formal nautical academy at Sagres, with lecture halls, libraries, and a curriculum. Scholars from across Europe and the Mediterranean gathered there to teach and learn. It was humanity's first research institute dedicated to oceanic science, a 15th century precursor to modern universities. It's a beautiful story. It's also probably not true, at least not in that formal sense. Modern historians have found little concrete evidence for a formal institution with regular classes and enrolled students. No building foundations that clearly served as classrooms. No records of faculty appointments or graduation ceremonies. No contemporary accounts explicitly describing an academy. So was the whole thing a myth? Not exactly. Here's where the truth gets more interesting than the legend. What Henry created at Sagres wasn't a formal school in the modern sense. It was something arguably more revolutionary for its time. An informal but highly effective collaborative workshop where knowledge was shared and problems were solved collectively. Think of it less like a university and more like a Renaissance workshop or a modern startup incubator. There weren't formal lectures, but there were constant discussions. There weren't enrolled students, but there were apprentices learning from masters. There weren't textbooks, but there were charts, instruments, and most importantly, the accumulated wisdom of returning explorers. The evidence suggests that Sagres and nearby Lagos became gathering places for anyone interested in maritime exploration. Henry's reputation and wealth attracted talent. Shipbuilders came to experiment with new designs. Cartographers arrived to update maps based on new discoveries. Instrument makers worked on improving navigational tools. Captains preparing for voyages consulted with those who had already sailed the routes. This was revolutionary precisely because it was informal. In medieval Europe, knowledge was typically controlled by guilds or the church, passed down through rigid apprenticeship systems or clerical hierarchies. But at Sagres, knowledge flowed more freely. A Jewish astronomer could work alongside a Christian shipbuilder and a Muslim mathematician. Ideas were tested through actual voyages rather than through appeals to ancient authorities. Contemporary documents do confirm some specific facts. We know Henry maintained detailed charts that were updated after each voyage. We know he employed cartographers like Jehuda Cresques, a famous Majorcan mapmaker. We know he consulted with scholars about astronomy and geography. We know he systematically gathered information from every captain who sailed for him. What Henry created was essentially a knowledge management system centuries before such concepts existed. Every voyage was a research expedition. Every returning captain was debriefed. Every discovery was documented and incorporated into the collective knowledge base. This information then informed the next voyage, creating a virtuous cycle of learning. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A captain preparing to sail down the African coast could consult charts showing what previous expeditions had discovered. He could talk to sailors who had actually navigated those waters. He could learn about seasonal wind patterns, dangerous reefs, and safe anchorages. He could get advice about dealing with local populations. He was standing on the shoulders of everyone who had gone before him. This systematic approach to knowledge gathering was genuinely revolutionary. In an age when most explorers hoarded their discoveries as trade secrets, Henry was creating a commons of maritime knowledge. In an age when most learning happened through rote memorization of ancient texts, Henry was promoting empirical observation and experimentation. The instruments developed and perfected at Sagres tell part of the story. The improved astrolabe that allowed sailors to measure latitude more accurately. The quadrant for determining the height of celestial bodies. Better compasses. More accurate sandglasses for keeping time. These tools didn't materialize magically. They were the product of sustained collaboration between instrument makers, astronomers, and practical sailors. The same goes for ship design. The famous Portuguese caravel, the vessel that would carry explorers across the oceans, was perfected through years of experimentation and incremental improvement. It combined features from different maritime traditions, the triangular lateen sails from Mediterranean ships, hull designs that could handle Atlantic swells, the ability to sail close to the wind that was crucial for return voyages against prevailing currents. So while there may not have been a formal school of navigation with a dean and registered students, what existed at Sagres was in many ways more important. A collaborative environment where theory met practice, where knowledge was systematically gathered and shared, where innovation was encouraged and rewarded. The legend of the School of Navigation emerged later as historians tried to make sense of how Portugal, a small, relatively poor kingdom, managed to take the lead in the age of discovery. They reasoned that there must have been some institutional explanation, some formal structure that explained Portugal's success, and they weren't entirely wrong. There was a structure, just not the kind they imagined. What Henry created was the first organized program of oceanic exploration, the first systematic attempt to turn discovery into a science rather than an adventure. Whether we call it a school or a workshop or a think tank doesn't really matter. What matters is that it worked. Knowledge accumulated, skills improved, ships got better, and voyages pushed farther and farther into the unknown. In the end, the Navigators of Sagres didn't learn from textbooks and lectures. They learned from the sea itself, from trial and error, from success and failure, from courage and persistence. But they learned together, building on each other's experiences, and that collective learning is what ultimately conquered the Atlantic. The school of navigation might be more legend than fact, but the spirit behind the legend, the idea that knowledge should be shared, that exploration should be systematic, that humanity can conquer the unknown through organized effort, that spirit was absolutely real, and it changed everything. Let me tell you about something that might seem boring, but is actually one of the most revolutionary aspects of the Sagres story: cartography, maps, charts. Those pieces of parchment that showed where the world was, and more importantly, where it wasn't. In the early 15th century, European maps were disasters. Seriously, they were more fantasy than fact. Mapmakers combined outdated information from ancient Roman sources with medieval religious symbolism and pure speculation. The result was often beautiful, but useless for actual navigation. The standard world map of the time, called a mappa mundi, placed Jerusalem at the center of the world because that's where it should be theologically, not because anyone had actually measured it. These maps showed mythical kingdoms, imaginary islands, and fantastical creatures. East was at the top because that's where Eden was supposed to be. Dragons and sea monsters filled the unknown spaces with the warning, "Here be dragons." For navigation, medieval sailors relied on something called portolan charts, practical maps showing coastal features and compass bearings between ports. These were reasonably accurate for the Mediterranean, where they'd been tested and refined over centuries. But they didn't extend to the Atlantic or around Africa because nobody had mapped those waters yet. This is where the Navigators of Sagres created a revolution. Henry established a systematic process for map-making that was unprecedented in its rigor and scope. Every expedition that sailed for him carried detailed instructions to observe and record everything: coastline features, water depths, dangerous rocks and reefs, safe anchorages, the location of rivers and settlements, latitude measurements, local currents and winds. When captains returned, they were debriefed extensively. Their observations were added to a master chart that was constantly updated. Think of it as a living document, a collaborative map that grew more accurate and detailed with each voyage. This was revolutionary. Instead of relying on ancient authorities or imagination, the Portuguese were creating maps based on direct observation and measurement. Henry employed some of the best cartographers of the age. Jehuda Cresques, son of the famous Abraham Cresques, who had created the Catalan Atlas, worked for Henry. These Majorcan Jewish cartographers brought sophisticated techniques and knowledge from the Islamic world, where mathematics and astronomy were more advanced than in Christian Europe. The maps created at Sagres incorporated mathematical principles that allowed for more accurate representation of the Earth's curved surface on flat parchment. They used networks of rhumb lines, compass bearings radiating from compass roses, that helped sailors plot courses. They marked latitude with increasing precision as astronomical navigation improved. But here's what made these maps truly revolutionary. They showed what wasn't there as much as what was. As Portuguese ships pushed down the African coast, the maps expanded to include new coastlines, but they also eliminated mythical features. The imaginary river of gold that was supposed to flow through West Africa, removed when explorers found it didn't exist. The legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, constantly relocated as explorers failed to find it in each new region they reached. This might sound simple, but it represented a fundamental shift in how Europeans thought about knowledge. Instead of believing ancient authorities or religious teachings about what should be in a place, they were accepting what their own eyes told them was actually there. Empirical observation was trumping traditional authority. The strategic value of these maps cannot be overstated. Portugal guarded them as state secrets. The maps represented an enormous competitive advantage. They contained years of hard-won knowledge about winds, currents, coastlines, and safe harbors that other nations would have to rediscover from scratch. The penalty for smuggling Portuguese maps out of the kingdom could be death. In 1504, King Manuel I of Portugal created the position of chief cosmographer, whose job was to maintain the official Padrão Real, the royal master chart incorporating all discoveries. Only authorized copies could be made, and these were entrusted only to trusted captains. Portugal's lead in exploration was built partly on superior maps and the determination to keep them secret. The cartographic work at Sagres also drove improvements in navigation instruments. You can't make accurate maps without accurate measurements, which required better astrolabes for measuring latitude, better compasses for determining direction, and better methods for estimating distance traveled. The mapmakers' needs pushed instrument makers to innovate. One particularly important innovation was the technique for determining latitude using the height of the sun or North Star. By the mid-15th century, Portuguese navigators were carrying tables showing the sun's declination throughout the year. By measuring the sun's height at noon and consulting these tables, they could calculate their latitude with reasonable accuracy. This allowed them to sail boldly out into the Atlantic, confident they could find their way back to the correct latitude and then sail east until they hit land. The impact of better maps extended far beyond navigation. They changed how Europeans saw the world and their place in it. As maps incorporated new discoveries, the world literally expanded in European consciousness. Lands that didn't exist on medieval maps suddenly appeared. The coastline of Africa extended much farther than anyone had imagined. Islands appeared in the Atlantic. The world was becoming larger, more complex, and more filled with possibilities. Consider what this meant psychologically. A medieval European looking at a mappa mundi saw a complete finished world. Everything was known, named, and in its proper place. But a Portuguese navigator looking at the constantly updated charts from Sagres saw a world still being discovered. A world with vast blank spaces waiting to be filled in. The map itself became an invitation to explore, a visual representation of possibility and opportunity. The maps also changed the nature of royal power. Kings who had previously competed over territory in Europe now competed over claims to newly discovered lands halfway around the world. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, was essentially a negotiation over maps, drawing lines on parchment that would determine which European power could claim which parts of the globe. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, Portuguese maps showed accurate coastline details for more than 3,000 kilometers of the African coast, territory that hadn't appeared on any European map a few decades earlier. The Atlantic islands of Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde had been discovered, charted, and colonized. The maps proved that systematic exploration could work, that the unknown could be made known through persistent effort. These weren't just maps, they were documentation of humanity's expanding horizons. They were proof that the world was larger and stranger than anyone had imagined. They were tools that turned the ocean from an impassable mystery into a navigable highway. And they were created here at Sagres by the navigators who dared to chart the unknown. The cartographic revolution that began at Sagres ultimately culminated in maps that showed the entire world. By the mid-16th century, European maps included the Americas, the route around Africa to India, and even the Pacific. The blank spaces were filling in, and that process started with those Portuguese navigators painstakingly recording every league of newly discovered coastline, every safe harbor, every dangerous reef. Those maps changed everything. They opened the world, and they were drawn by the hands of men who sailed beyond the edge of the known world and returned to tell us what they found there. Now let's talk about the vessels that actually carried these brave navigators into the unknown, the ships themselves. Because without the right ships, all the maps, instruments, and courage in the world wouldn't have mattered. You can't sail beyond the edge of the world in a boat that can't handle the journey. When Henry began his maritime enterprise in the early 15th century, European ships were essentially of two types, and neither was ideal for oceanic exploration. Northern European ships, the kind used by the Vikings and medieval merchants in the North Sea and Atlantic, were sturdy, square-rigged vessels that could handle rough seas. But they were slow, difficult to maneuver, and couldn't sail effectively against the wind. Mediterranean ships, on the other hand, used triangular lateen sails that allowed them to tack against the wind. This made them highly maneuverable and efficient. But they were generally smaller, lighter vessels, designed for the relatively calm Mediterranean waters, not the rough Atlantic swells. Neither design would work for what Henry envisioned. He needed ships that could survive Atlantic storms, sail efficiently with the wind, and most importantly, and this is crucial, sail back against prevailing winds and currents. This last requirement was what had kept earlier explorers from pushing far down the African coast. Even if you could sail south with favorable winds and currents, how would you get back? The solution emerged gradually through experimentation at Portuguese shipyards, and it became one of the most important vessels in history, the caravel. This ship was a revolutionary hybrid that combined the best features of both northern and Mediterranean designs. The caravel was relatively small, typically between 50 and 70 feet long, which made it nimble and easier to handle with small crews. It had a shallow draft, meaning it didn't sit deep in the water, which allowed it to explore close to coastlines, navigate rivers, and approach beaches that deeper ships couldn't reach. This was crucial for exploration. You could send a caravel into shallow waters to investigate without risk of running aground. But the revolutionary feature was its sail configuration. The classic caravel used 2 or 3 lateen sails on raked masts. This rig allowed the ship to sail remarkably close to the wind, as close as 6 points off the wind, which meant it could tack back and forth and make progress even when sailing nearly into the wind. This solved the return voyage problem. Even against the prevailing north winds and currents off Africa, a caravel could zigzag its way home. Later versions, called Caravella Redonda, mixed square sails with lateen sails, combining the efficiency of square rigging when running before the wind with the maneuverability of lateen sails when working against the wind. This hybrid configuration became the standard for oceanic exploration. Picture one of these caravels in your mind. Its hull is carvel-built, meaning the planks are laid edge to edge rather than overlapped, creating a smooth hull that moved efficiently through the water. The sides rise relatively high compared to the ship's length, helping it handle large ocean swells. The stern is sharply pointed, a design that helped the ship handle following seas when waves come from behind without being swamped or pushed sideways. The masts rake backwards slightly, which helped balance the force of the sails and made the ship easier to steer. The lateen sails themselves are triangular, suspended from long yards that can be adjusted to catch the wind from almost any angle. Watching a caravel tack into the wind is like watching a dancer, The crew hauls the heavy yards around the masts, the sails fill from the opposite side, and the ship pivots and continues forward on the new heading. Inside, these ships were cramped, uncomfortable, and incredibly basic by modern standards. There were no separate cabins, except perhaps a small one for the captain. The crew slept wherever they could find space on deck or below, often in rotation. Supplies, cargo, and equipment filled much of the limited space. On a voyage lasting weeks or months, the ship would have been crowded, smelly, damp, and thoroughly uncomfortable. But caravels were supremely functional for exploration. They could carry sufficient supplies for long voyages despite their small size. They required relatively small crews, perhaps 20 to 30 men, which meant less food and water needed to be carried. They were fast enough to cover long distances and maneuverable enough to escape danger or investigate unknown coastlines. The most famous caravels in history include the Niña and the Pinta, two of the three ships Columbus sailed to the Americas in 1492. Both were caravels, while the Santa Maria was a larger, slower carrack. When the Santa Maria wrecked in the Caribbean, Columbus returned to Europe in the Niña, which proved the caravel's capability for ocean crossing. But the development of the caravel didn't stop with exploration. As Portuguese ventures shifted from exploration to trade, the design evolved into larger variants. The caravel redonda became common for trading voyages, as square sails were more efficient when running before the wind with cargoes of spices or slaves. Eventually, the design influenced larger ships like carracks and galleons that would dominate oceanic trade for the next 2 centuries. The shipyards around Sagres, particularly at nearby Lagos, became centers of innovation in ship design. Shipwrights experimented with different hull shapes, sail configurations, and construction techniques. Each improvement was tested on actual voyages, and successful innovations were incorporated into future vessels. This iterative process of design, testing, and refinement was revolutionary for its time. In medieval Europe, most crafts were bound by tradition. You built things the way your master had built them, the way his master had built them before that. But at Sagres and Lagos, Prince Henry encouraged innovation. If a new design worked better, it was adopted regardless of tradition. The Portuguese also developed specialized navigation and combat capabilities into their ships. By the late 15th century, caravels were being armed with small cannon, transforming them from pure exploration vessels into ships that could defend themselves or even dominate local coastlines. This would prove crucial as Portuguese commercial interests expanded into contested waters. Think about what these ships represented. Each caravel that sailed from Portugal was carrying not just men and supplies, but the accumulated knowledge of Portuguese maritime development. The hull design embodied years of refinement. The sail configuration represented solved problems in physics and aerodynamics. The construction techniques reflected generational learning in shipbuilding, and every voyage tested these designs in the harshest laboratory imaginable, the open ocean. Ships that weren't up to the task simply didn't return. The ones that did return provided feedback for the next generation of vessels. This was evolution in action, but directed by human intelligence and purpose. Standing at Sagres today, looking out at the Atlantic, it's easy to imagine those caravels setting out from nearby harbors. Small wooden vessels, sails filling with wind, heading out into the vast unknown. They must have looked impossibly tiny against the immensity of the ocean, like children's toys set loose in a bathtub. But those small wooden ships changed the world. They proved that humans could master the oceans. They opened routes to every corner of the globe. They connected civilizations that had never known of each other's existence. And they did it through brilliant design, constant refinement, and the courage of the men who sailed them beyond the edge of the known world. The caravel was more than a ship. It was a tool that unlocked the planet. And it was perfected here by the Navigators of Sagres, who understood that conquering the unknown required not just brave men, but the right vessels to carry them there and back. Now let me tell you about the men themselves, the captains and crews who actually sailed into the unknown. Because behind every line on those expanding maps, behind every newly discovered island or stretch of coastline, there were real people who risked everything on voyages that might not return. These weren't superhuman heroes from mythology. They were Portuguese sailors, often from modest backgrounds, who signed on for voyages that everyone believed might be their last. They sailed ships that were tiny by modern standards, into waters nobody had charted, toward destinations nobody could guarantee existed, and they did it repeatedly, voyage after voyage, pushing the boundaries of the known world a little farther each time. Let's start with Gil Enes, because his story captures the psychology of what these men were facing. In 1434, Prince Henry sent Enes to sail past Cape Bojador on the African coast. Now, to modern ears, this sounds unremarkable. Cape Bojador is just a promontory on the Moroccan coast, nothing particularly dramatic about it. But to 15th century sailors, it was the end of the navigable world. For years, Portuguese captains had sailed down the African coast and turned back at Cape Bojador. The waters there were treacherous, with strong currents and dangerous shoals. Sailors returning from failed attempts reported that the seas turned red and boiled, that monsters lurked beneath the waves, that ships that ventured too far would never be able to sail back against the current. These weren't cowards making excuses. These were professional sailors who had risked their lives many times before. But Cape Bojador represented a psychological barrier that was almost impossible to cross. It was the edge of the world as they knew it, and every instinct told them not to go beyond. Henry sent Enes to try in 1433. He turned back like everyone before him, but Henry didn't punish him or dismiss him. Instead, he sent him again in 1434 with a simple message: just try. Just see what's actually there, rather than what you fear is there. And Enes did it. He sailed past Cape Bojador, discovered that the ocean didn't boil and monsters didn't attack, and returned safely. It wasn't a long voyage or a dramatic discovery. He didn't find gold or new lands, but what he did was psychologically revolutionary. He proved that the barrier was in men's minds, not in the ocean itself. After Enes broke through, exploration accelerated. Subsequent captains could tell themselves, if Enes could go that far, surely I can go a bit farther. Fear was replaced by curiosity and ambition. Within a few years, Portuguese ships were exploring hundreds of kilometers farther down the African coast. Another remarkable figure was Diogo Gomes, who sailed multiple expeditions for Henry in the 1450s. Gomes explored the coast of Senegal and discovered several rivers flowing into the Atlantic. His voyages were crucial in mapping West Africa and establishing trading contacts with African kingdoms. Later in life, Gomes wrote an account of his experiences that provides one of our best sources about Henry's enterprise and the motivations of the men who sailed for him. What's striking about Gomes's account is its practicality. He doesn't portray himself as a hero or emphasize dramatic dangers. Instead, he talks about navigation techniques, trade negotiations, and the details of African coastal geography. For him and his fellow captains, exploration had become a profession, a job they approached with professional skill and careful preparation. Then there's Álvaro Fernandes, who in 1446 sailed farther south than anyone before him, reaching beyond present-day Guinea-Bissau. Fernandes pushed the limits, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see what was there. His voyage demonstrated that Portuguese sailors were no longer just following orders. They had caught the exploration fever themselves. But not all voyages were successful, and we need to talk about that too. Many expeditions never returned. Ships were lost to storms, wrecked on unknown reefs, or simply disappeared without trace. Entire crews perished from disease, violence, or shipwreck. The mortality rate among early explorers was staggering, easily 50% or more on some voyages. Consider what it meant to sign on for one of these expeditions. You'd board a small wooden ship, perhaps 60 feet long, with 20 or 30 other men. Your living space would be cramped, damp, and uncomfortable. Food would be salt pork, hardtack, and dried fish, supplemented by whatever you could catch or find. Water would be rationed and often stagnant by the end of a long voyage. You'd sail for weeks or months into waters nobody had charted. Every headland could hide a deadly reef. Every storm could sink your ship. Disease, scurvy, dysentery, fevers could strike at any time. If you encountered hostile locals, your small crew would be vastly outnumbered. If your ship was damaged far from home, rescue was impossible. And the return voyage was often more dangerous than the outbound journey. You'd be sailing against prevailing winds and currents in a ship that might be damaged, with supplies running low and perhaps some of your crew already dead from disease or violence. Many ships that successfully completed the outbound journey never made it home. So why did they do it? The motivations were mixed, as human motivations always are. Money was certainly a factor. Successful expeditions could bring wealth through trade or discovery. Glory and honor mattered in an age that celebrated martial courage. Religious conviction drove some men who saw exploration as a crusade. And for many, there was simply the raw human desire to see what lay beyond the horizon, to be the first to discover something new. The crews themselves were diverse. Portuguese sailors formed the core, but they were joined by adventurers, traders, and fortune-seekers from across Europe. Genoese, Venetians, Spanish, and others sailed on Portuguese expeditions. Some were skilled navigators, others were ordinary seamen learning their craft on the job. Some were criminals offered pardons in exchange for service, others were young men seeking adventure. Life aboard these ships was governed by strict discipline. The captain's word was absolute law. It had to be, when survival depended on quick decisions and unified action. Mutiny was punished by death, but good captains also knew their crews were their most valuable resource and treated them fairly. A captain who lost the confidence of his men might find himself abandoned in some distant port or worse. The relationship between these captains and Prince Henry was fascinating. Henry provided the ships, the supplies, and the backing, but he couldn't accompany them on their voyages. He had to trust that his captains would push as far as possible, document what they found, and return with useful information. In return, successful captains gained wealth, land grants, and prestigious positions. Some of these men became legends in their own time. By the 1460s, when Henry died, Portuguese captains had become celebrities in Europe. Their accounts of distant lands, strange peoples, and exotic goods captivated audiences. They'd proven that ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things through courage and skill. The legacy of these captains extends far beyond their individual voyages. They established a tradition of Portuguese seamanship that would dominate oceanic exploration for the next century. The skills they developed, the routes they pioneered, and the techniques they perfected were passed down to the next generation of explorers. Bartolomeu Dias, who rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488. Vasco da Gama, who reached India by sea in 1498. Pedro Álvares Cabral, who claimed Brazil for Portugal in 1500. Ferdinand Magellan, whose expedition first circumnavigated the globe. All of these famous explorers built on the foundation laid by the earlier, lesser-known captains who served Prince Henry. These brave captains weren't perfect. Many participated in the early slave trade, capturing Africans and bringing them back to Portugal. They could be brutal in their dealings with indigenous peoples. They claimed lands and resources that didn't belong to them. The age of discovery had a dark side, and these men were part of it. But we can acknowledge both the courage of these men and the consequences of their actions. They risked everything to push beyond the known world. They developed techniques and gathered knowledge that fundamentally changed human civilization. They proved that systematic exploration could work, that the unknown could be conquered through persistence and skill. Standing at Sagres today, I think about these men constantly. Every time I look at the ocean, I imagine them sailing out of sight of land for the first time, not knowing if they'd ever see home again. Every time the wind picks up, I imagine them in storms, fighting to keep their small ships afloat. Every time I see a detailed map of Africa or Asia, I remember that every line on that map represents a voyage someone made, risks someone took. The Navigators of Sagres weren't just following orders or seeking wealth. They were answering a fundamental human impulse, the drive to know what's beyond the horizon, to explore the unknown, to expand the boundaries of human experience. That impulse, and the courage to act on it, changed the world forever. Now let's talk about what all this effort actually achieved, the discoveries that transformed the world from a collection of isolated regions into an interconnected globe. Because the impact of the Navigators of Sagres extended far beyond a few new lines on maps. They opened doors that would never be closed again. The first major achievement was the Atlantic Islands. Between 1419 and 1452, Portuguese explorers discovered and colonized Madeira, the Azores, and later the Cape Verde Islands. These might seem like minor discoveries compared to finding new continents, but they were actually revolutionary in their own right. The Atlantic Islands proved several crucial points. First, they demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean wasn't an endless empty waste, but contained habitable lands. Second, they provided stepping stones for longer voyages. Ships could resupply at these islands before pushing farther into the unknown. Third, they became laboratories for colonization, where Portuguese developed techniques they'd later use in Brazil and elsewhere. Madeira especially became an economic powerhouse. The Portuguese introduced sugarcane, and within a few decades Madeira was one of Europe's primary sugar producers. This wasn't just about economics, it was proof that distant discoveries could yield tangible wealth, which funded further exploration. Success bred more investment, which bred more success. The Azores, situated far out in the Atlantic, demonstrated the power of latitude sailing. Portuguese navigators learned to sail west to the Azores by maintaining a constant latitude, then south or north to their final destination. This technique of latitude sailing would become fundamental to oceanic navigation for centuries. But the most important discoveries were along the African coast. Year by year, decade by decade, Portuguese ships pushed farther south. Each voyage added new coastline to the maps, new information about winds and currents, new contacts with African peoples and kingdoms. Cape Bojador was passed in 1434. Cape Blanc was reached in 1441. The Senegal River was discovered in 1444. Cape Verde was rounded in 1444. The Gambia River was explored in 1446. Each of these represented not just a geographic milestone, but a psychological victory, proof that the next impossible thing could become possible. These voyages opened trade with West African kingdoms. Portuguese merchants began exchanging European goods for gold, ivory, and tragically enslaved people. By the 1450s, hundreds of African captives were being brought to Portugal annually, beginning a slave trade that would eventually transport millions of Africans to the Americas. This was exploration's darkest legacy, and we cannot discuss the age of discovery without acknowledging this horror. But the geographic discoveries continued. After Henry's death in 1460, Portuguese exploration didn't stop, it accelerated. His successors continued his policies, pushing farther down the African coast. In 1471, the equator was crossed. In 1482, the Congo River was discovered. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa had a southern end and that a sea route to India was possible. Then came the moment that validated everything Henry had worked toward. In 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed from Portugal around Africa and reached Calicut in India. He returned in 1499 with a cargo of spices worth 60 times the cost of his expedition. The sea route to the Indies was open. Portugal suddenly had direct access to the most valuable trade goods in the world, bypassing all the Muslim and Venetian middlemen who had previously controlled that trade. Think about what this meant economically. Before da Gama's voyage, spices from the Indies traveled through Muslim-controlled trade routes, passing through many hands, with each adding their markup. By the time pepper reached Europe, it was literally worth more than its weight in gold. But now, Portuguese ships could sail directly to the source, buy cheap, and sell dear in Europe. The profit margins were staggering, hundreds or even thousands of % on successful voyages. Within a few years, Portugal established a trading empire stretching from Brazil to Japan. Trading posts and fortresses were built along the African coast, in India, in Indonesia, in China. Portuguese became the first truly global language spoken on every continent. Portuguese ships dominated the Indian Ocean, enforcing a trading monopoly through superior naval technology. But the discoveries weren't just Portuguese. The techniques and knowledge developed at Sagres spread throughout Europe. Christopher Columbus, though sailing for Spain, used Portuguese navigation methods and likely studied Portuguese maps. His famous 1492 voyage to the Americas was built on the foundation the Portuguese had laid. The discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492, followed by countless expeditions by Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch explorers, opened an entirely new hemisphere to European contact. The world literally doubled in size from a European perspective. Lands that hadn't existed on any European map suddenly became destinations for trade, colonization, and conquest. In 1519-1522, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, funded by Spain but led by a Portuguese navigator trained in the Portuguese tradition, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. Human beings had finally sailed all the way around the planet. The world was proven to be round through direct observation, not just theory. And every ocean was now a known quantity, at least in outline. The economic impact was tremendous. New foods from the Americas, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, tobacco, transformed European agriculture and diet. Silver from American mines flooded into Europe, changing the entire monetary system. Spices from Asia became more affordable and common. Global trade networks emerged, connecting all the inhabited continents for the first time in human history. But the human impact was catastrophic for many peoples. Indigenous populations in the Americas were decimated by European diseases to which they had no immunity. Entire civilizations collapsed. The Atlantic slave trade expanded enormously as European colonizers in the Americas needed labor for plantations and mines. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in conditions of unspeakable cruelty. Traditional societies around the world were disrupted or destroyed by European contact. Technologies, religions, diseases, and ideas spread rapidly along the new global networks, often with devastating effects on peoples who had no time to adapt. The age of discovery brought the world together, but at an enormous human cost that we're still reckoning with today. The intellectual impact was equally profound. Europeans were forced to grapple with the existence of peoples and civilizations they hadn't known existed. The discovery of the Americas especially challenged European worldviews. How could these lands and peoples exist if they weren't mentioned in the Bible? How had they gotten there? Were they fully human? These questions sparked debates that helped launch modern anthropology, ethnography, and comparative religion. The scientific impact was revolutionary. Explorers returned with specimens of plants and animals that didn't exist in Europe. New foods required new categories in botanical classification. The diversity of human cultures challenged assumptions about human nature and society. The accurate mapping of the entire globe required advances in mathematics, astronomy, and cartography. Exploration and science became intertwined in ways they hadn't been before. The Navigators of Sagres didn't discover everything themselves, but they started the process. They proved that systematic exploration could work. They developed the techniques and tools that made global navigation possible. They trained the generation of explorers who would ultimately chart the entire planet. By the mid-16th century, barely 100 years after Prince Henry's death, Europeans had discovered and mapped most of the world's coastlines. The age of mystery was ending. The age of global connections was beginning. And it all started here, at Sagres, with a small group of men who refused to believe that the horizon was the end of the world. The discoveries that began at Sagres opened new worlds in every sense: geographic, economic, cultural, and intellectual. They connected human civilizations that had developed in isolation for tens of thousands of years. They created the first truly global economy. They sparked a scientific revolution that would transform human understanding of the natural world. These discoveries came at a terrible cost, especially for indigenous peoples around the world, but they also represent a pivotal moment in human history, the moment when humanity became truly global, when we stopped being isolated groups scattered across the planet and became an interconnected species sharing one world. The Navigators of Sagres couldn't have imagined all the consequences of what they started. They were focused on immediate goals, finding trade routes, claiming new territories, returning with valuable cargo. But they unleashed forces that would reshape human civilization completely. The world they opened would never be closed again. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the story of the Navigators of Sagres. We've stood at that windswept fortress at the edge of the world. We've met Prince Henry and understood his revolutionary vision. We've examined the ships, the maps, the instruments, and the techniques that made the Age of Discovery possible. We've followed brave captains into unknown waters, and we've seen how their discoveries opened the world and changed human history forever. But here's the thing. This story isn't really over. The spirit that drove those navigators, that impulse to explore and discover, to push beyond the known boundaries, that's still alive today. We might not be sailing into uncharted oceans anymore, but we're still explorers. We're exploring space, the deep sea, the microscopic world, the digital realm, and the mysteries of human consciousness. Every time a scientist investigates a new question, they're following in the tradition of the Navigators of Sagres. Every time an engineer solves a problem nobody has solved before, they're embodying that same spirit. Every time anyone pushes beyond the comfortable and familiar to discover something new, they're continuing that legacy. So, I want to hear from you. What resonates with you about this story? Is it the courage of men who sailed into the unknown, the systematic approach of Prince Henry and his vision of organized discovery, the revolutionary technology of the caravels and navigation instruments, the way knowledge was shared and built upon at Sagres? What aspects of this story surprise you? Did you know about the Portuguese role in launching the Age of Discovery? Had you heard of Prince Henry the Navigator before? Were you aware of how much innovation happened at this one location? And here's the really interesting question. What are we exploring today that future generations will look back on the way we look back at the Navigators of Sagres? What are the modern equivalents of sailing beyond Cape Bojador? Where are the edges of our world that seem impassable until someone brave enough proves they're not? I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts on these questions. The comment section is your space to share your perspective, to add to the conversation, to bring your own knowledge and insights to this story. Maybe you know more about Portuguese history. Maybe you're a sailor and can add insights about navigation. Maybe you've visited Sagres yourself and can share your experience. Maybe you're an expert on some aspect of this story I've only touched on briefly. Or maybe you just have questions. Ask them. That's what the comment section is for. If something I've discussed isn't clear, if you want to know more about a specific aspect, if you disagree with my interpretation of events, share it. The best conversations happen when people engage, question, and challenge each other's ideas respectfully. And if you found this deep dive into history valuable, if you learned something or saw the past in a new way, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of content I love creating, deep explorations of historical moments that changed the world, told in a way that makes them relevant and engaging for today. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of curious people who want to understand how we got here, how the past shaped the present, and what we can learn from the people who came before us. You're saying that history matters, that these stories are worth preserving and understanding, that we can learn from both the triumphs and the mistakes of previous generations. Also, please leave a like on this video. I know that sounds like a simple request, but those likes actually matter. They tell YouTube that this content is valuable, which means the algorithm will show it to more people. Every like helps more people discover these stories, helps this community grow, and helps me justify the time and research that goes into creating these in-depth historical explorations. Share this video with someone who might find it interesting. Send it to that friend who loves history. Post it in that forum where people discuss exploration and discovery. Share it with a teacher who might use it in class. Every share extends the reach of these stories and introduces more people to the fascinating history of how humanity came to understand and explore our world. The Navigators of Sagres changed the world because they were willing to go beyond the comfortable and familiar, to question assumptions, to systematically gather knowledge, and to persist despite setbacks and fears. They showed that organized human effort, guided by curiosity and courage, could achieve things that seemed impossible. That lesson is timeless. Whatever frontier you're facing, whether it's a literal frontier like space exploration or a personal frontier like learning a new skill or changing careers, the principles remain the same. Gather knowledge, develop your tools, learn from those who've gone before, persist through setbacks, work with others, stay curious, push beyond the comfortable. The world still needs explorers. It needs people who see the horizon not as a boundary, but as an invitation. It needs people who ask, what if, and why not, and let's find out. It needs people who combine careful preparation with bold action, who respect the unknown while refusing to be paralyzed by it. Maybe that's you. Maybe something in this story sparked something in your mind or heart. Maybe you're realizing that exploration isn't just about ships and oceans. It's a mindset, an approach to life, a way of engaging with the world and its mysteries. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and move on. Engage with it. Comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe to continue this journey through history with me. Like the video to help more people discover these stories. And most importantly, take something from this story into your own life. Be a navigator in your own way. Find your Sagres, that place where you can develop your skills and knowledge. Build your caravel, whatever tools or capabilities you need for your journey. Gather your crew, the people who support and challenge you, and then sail beyond your Cape Bojador, past whatever psychological or practical barrier has been holding you back. The Navigators of Sagres proved that the impossible can become possible, that the unknown can become known, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they combine vision, preparation, persistence, and courage. Their story belongs to all of us. It's our shared human heritage, a reminder of what we're capable of when we dare to explore, when we refuse to accept that the horizon is the end of the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Now it's your turn. Comment below, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let's keep exploring together. Because the age of discovery never really ended, it just moved to new frontiers. And those frontiers are waiting for the next generation of navigators brave enough to explore them. The men of Sagres changed the world. Now it's our turn. Let's make them proud.